What's going on? What's going on? Welcome to the Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson. Thank you for joining me this evening, man. We got a great one for you today. I got Mr. IP, Mike Jones. They're gonna be debating. He's gonna be debating Jim Majors, man. It's going down, man. We're going down. We're gonna have a great debate today, man. Was Jesus buried in the tomb? We're gonna find out today, and we're gonna see if these arguments hold up strong, man. These guys decided to jump into the Gospel Truth octagon, man. We're gonna battle out some Jesus Christ, some tomb burial. What's going on with this stuff, man? But I want to thank you guys for joining me on the Gospel Truth. I thank you for taking time out, spending time with us this evening. Before we bring you guys in, I do want to encourage you to like and follow the Gospel Truth, subscribe, do what you have to do to stay in the loop with the Gospel Truth. I don't want you out the loop, I want you in the loop, because we have some great debates coming up. We have some great stuff coming up on the Gospel Truth. With that said, let me go over a couple of announcements and shows that we have coming up in the future. All right, coming up July 27th, 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I have Jack Shannon versus Stephen Boyce. Does the Bible teach that remarriage is always sinful? That's coming up July 27th at 12 p.m. Remember, 12 p.m., that's 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. After that, I have Joseph Lowell versus Jeremiah Notier, and they're going to debate Mormon versus Christian, different worldview perspectives. That's coming up July 31st, 12 p.m. This is another early one, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Remember that. After that, I have Richard Suttles coming up. Robert McKeever, Atheist versus Christian. Are moral intuitions necessarily moral facts? That's coming up August 3rd, 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that, I have Riz and myself, yours truly, gonna be jumping into a debate, man. Atheist versus Christian. We're gonna be talking about a little morality. It's gonna be more like a discussion instead of a full-blown debate. He just gonna come on. We're gonna chop it up a little bit. All right, that's coming up August 11th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Once again, that's just the next 4 shows coming up on the Gospel Truth. Make sure that you are liking. Make sure you are subscribing. Making sure that you are up to par on what we have going on at the Gospel Truth. Once again, stay in the loop. Do not fall out the loop, because you're going to miss a whole bunch of stuff, man. I don't want you missing nothing, especially with this coronavirus stuff going on right now, man. This is a prime opportunity to absorb all the Gospel Truth you can, man. Make sure you jump on that page and get all that content in. With that said, I'm going to bring these fellas in so they can introduce themselves, man. What's going on, fellas? How y'all doing, man? Thank you for joining me in this episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, what's going on, man?
All right. I'm glad you guys jumped on here, man. I reached out to Jim, man, and Jim didn't get right back to me. He had some stuff going on. Had to connect it with Mike Jones. We had to set it up, and here we are, man. Got a lot of people out there that was waiting for this debate. That's pretty excited about it. I had somebody hit me up, actually. Is that when you posted it on YouTube, Jim, they said they was promoted like it was a UFC fight, man. I started laughing. It was super hilarious, man.
The sponsors suck.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, thank you guys for joining me, man. Before we jump into the format of this debate, man, I'm going to go ahead and give you time to introduce yourself to the audience. For those who don't know you. All right, Jim, if you don't mind, man, give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
Sure thing. Everybody, I'm Jim Majors. This is my mustache, and I have a channel, youtube.com/Jim Majors, and I do counter apologetics. Although I mainly do debates, I'm working on getting more YouTube videos in there. But I was a Pentecostal pastor, now an atheist. I am currently in a PhD program for Hebrew Bible, biblical studies. And I'm really looking forward to this debate. And thanks so much for having me. And thanks, Mike, for wanting to do this.
All right. Thank you, Jim, also for joining me in this episode. All right, Mike, go ahead and give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
All right. Yeah, my name is Michael Jones, and I too have a mustache. It's not as big, though, unfortunately. I run Inspiring Philosophy, and I create a lot of animated graphic videos to defend Christianity and theism in general. I have some videos coming up on biblical archaeology, going to finish my Genesis 1 through 11 series and my Irreducible Mind series. So that's what I basically do on my channel. But yeah, thanks. I appreciate Jim having this debate. I'm looking forward to it as well.
All right. Yeah, man, I'm excited. I'm a big fan, Mike. I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, man. Keep doing it. Jim, I don't know, man. You kind of got me riled up, man. You got me riled up a little bit, but we're going to wrestle this out, man. We're going to have fun today. So we're going to jump into this debate. Obviously, the topic was Jesus buried in a tomb? All right, so we're going to come on. We're going to go with a 10-minute opening statement, a 5-minute rebuttal, 40-minute discussion, 5-minute closing, and Q&A from the audience. You guys good for that?
Mm-hmm.
All right, Mike, you'll argue me affirmative.
That sounds good to me.
All right, cool. You're arguing affirmative for this debate, Mike. So you're up for your 10-minute open. Let me pull up your slides, and then we'll jump right into it, man.
All right, I'll make these full screen here. Okay, should be able to see that then. Let me know when you're ready.
There we go. All right, Mike, you got it for 10 minutes, man.
All right, thanks. I got a lot to cover, so let's dive in. The topic is if Jesus was buried in a tomb, as the Gospels record. Now, some skeptics argue it's more likely Jesus was not buried in a tomb, and instead he was executed for the crime of insurrection against Rome. He would have been crucified and left to rot on the cross to send a powerful message to would-be rebels that this is what happens to anyone who challenges Rome. His body would later have been thrown into a mass unmarked grave, which, as Dale Allison says, is to deny someone a proper burial. Bart Ehrman is one of the biggest offenders of this position, and I'll make note of his work in my opening statement. Ehrman cites 5 sources that show crucified victims were left to rot on crosses, as well as 4 sources that bodies of criminals were typically thrown into mass unmarked graves, being denied a proper burial. However, later I'll show that Ehrman, in responding to Craig Evans, actually admits what really matters is what were the customs in Judea under Pilate. And none of the sources Ehrman relies on are actually talking about burial practices under Pilate. A fact we need to remember is Rome did not run a nanny state, and they allowed a lot of flexibility in how each province was governed. Larry Overstreet says, Roman law allowed the local law of each province to be exercised without much interference. Wolfgang Kunkel says, local administration, the administration of justice as between the natives of the province, and many other tasks were in general simply left to the political organs of the subject people. For example, Pliny the Younger mentions a group of people were released from prison because the proconsuls decided it was okay. An inscription in Ephesus mentions a decision of a proconsul to release prisoners because of the outcries of the people. Rome allowed each local ruler to run their province how they saw fit. So just because in some areas criminals were left on crosses instead of being buried, that doesn't mean this is how things were always done. In fact, most of Ehrman's sources are specific examples, not universal laws. The excerpt from Horace is about how specifically he would treat a disobedient slave. The next one is a specific inscription regarding the case of one man. This third one is not about someone who was crucified, but someone who dreamt he was and the author was interpreting his dream. Juvenal is writing poetry and mentions that vultures can get carry on from crosses. And the last one is a third-hand account of some Roman soldier in Ephesus guarding bodies on crosses. In regards to the burial sources, none of these directly cover burial practices of criminals under Pilate. However, we do have numerous passages that say the Jews were allowed to keep their sacred rituals and customs. Philo speaks of an incident where Pilate placed Roman shields on Herod's palace. Philo records that the magistrates went to Pilate and said not to make any alteration to their national customs, which had hitherto been preserved without any interruption, and that Tiberius is not desirous that any of our laws or customs shall be destroyed. And then Philo tells us the Jews wrote a letter to Tiberius, who sided with the Jews on the issue. Josephus agrees, and speaking of making idols, he says the Romans did not require their Jewish subjects to violate their national law. And later he also speaks of the importance of preserving all their laws. Elsewhere, he says the Roman procurators who succeeded Agrippa I kept the peace by abstaining from all interference with the customs of the country. Now, Ehrman rightly notes the passage in Against Appian is specifically about making images or idols. But what Josephus does to make his case is note the reason they don't make images is because they keep firmly to all their laws, which included burying the dead. We can see this in Deuteronomy, which says a body cannot remain all night on a tree but must be buried the same day because it will defile the land. That last section is important because it was about the purity of the land. Some try to say the Jews had to bury a body, but the law didn't require a Roman and Judea to do the same. But Deuteronomy required the Jews to bury body on their land, not just when they executed someone. And Against Appian, Josephus speaks of some of these laws and says, we must furnish fire, water, food to all who ask, point out the road, not leave a corpse unburied. Philo notes it was considered virtuous among the Jews to bury the dead, and this is also seen in the book of Tobit, and the Dead Sea Scrolls might speak of burying those who were crucified. Now, these sources obviously don't say a body had to be buried in a tomb, but my basic point is bodies left on crosses for days would have gone against Jewish law, and the evidence shows Tiberius allowed Jews to keep their laws. Regarding burial practices for the crucified, Ehrman acknowledges the existence of this passage in Philo, which says, upon the birthday of the emperor, crucified victims could be buried. Now, the context of this was a specific decision of the Roman governor in Egypt, and didn't extend outside of that realm, because once again, these matters were decided by each appointed ruler. And what we see with the neighboring province of Judea is the Jews were allowed to keep their laws. Now, Ehrman thinks this is the exception to the rule, but we do have other sources. For example, Josephus tells us the Jews took down those who were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. So he directly says the Jews buried crucified victims, and given that he also says the Roman procurators after Agrippa kept the peace by abstaining from all interference with the customs of the country, he's most likely referring to burial practices that led up to the Jewish war. This is backed by archaeological data, as we have found 2 crucified victims who were allowed a burial from the same general time period. And I hope to get more into this later. Now, it's false to say outside of Judea all the sources show crucified victims cannot be buried, as we have some sources I'm using as secondary evidence. We have a saying attributed to Quintilian, which might read as for those who die on the cross, the executioner does not forbid the burying of those who have been pierced. We can find a parallel to this in the Gospel of John. The later 6th century Digesta is a collection of Roman laws and says that during the time of Augustus, those condemned to death could be buried if the body was requested and permission granted. This parallels well with the Gospels, where Joseph of Arimathea requests the body of Jesus and it's granted to him. Now, it does say it's not always permitted, especially if the person committed high treason. But again, the source says it was up to each appointed ruler. It's not saying Rome never permitted this. Now, this is important because I was shocked to read one of Ehrman's reply to Craig Evans on this exact issue. Evans brought up the fact that Josephus says all the procurators after Agrippa abstained from interfering in the customs of the country, and Ehrman replied, but Agrippa I ruled Judea over a decade after Jesus. The procurators who succeeded him were later. This passage is not talking about what happened under the rule of Pontius Pilate during the days of Jesus. Well, it's convenient if you can just dismiss any source that doesn't speak of burial practices that happened under Pilate himself. But that's fine if it comes to it in this debate. We can limit ourselves to sources that only speak of burial practices under Pilate. And the only sources are basically the Gospels, and all of them say Jesus was allowed to be buried in a tomb after it was requested and granted, correlating with the Digesta. Now, perhaps Matthew and Luke were just copying Mark, but we don't really need them, as the early Passion narrative in Mark says Jesus was buried in a tomb. Bart Ehrman notes it's widely thought the Gospel of John did not rely on the other 3 Gospels for its information, which would count as another independent source for the burial of Jesus. Even if he is wrong, the early sermons preserved in Acts have been shown to have an Aramaic structure and also independently attest to the burial of Jesus. And Dale Allison notes the creed of 1 Corinthians 15 implies Jesus at least had a proper burial. To quote, the verb means bury and would hardly be used of unceremonious dumping of a criminal into an unmarked trench as dog food. That was not a burial, but it's denial. So the burial of Jesus is multiply attested, and there are no competing traditions from the 1st century that say otherwise. Jody Magnus, expert on Jewish burial practices, notes the burial of Jesus fits with standard Jewish burial practices. So to sum up, yes, we have sources outside of the domain of Pilate that say crucified victims were not buried, but we do have a source on Roman law that says those condemned to death could be buried if it was requested and granted. A saying attributed to Quintilian says someone on a cross could be buried if they were pierced. Philo says this happened in Egypt. Josephus says the Jews did bury crucified victims, and the archaeological evidence supports it. Jewish sources express the importance of burying bodies so their land would not be defiled. Philo and Josephus record Rome did allow them to keep their sacred customs and rituals. The burial of Jesus is multiply attested. It's consistent with standard Jewish burial practices, and there are no competing traditions from the 1st century that say otherwise. So the evidence is clearly stacked in favor of saying Jesus was actually buried in the tomb. Dale Allison also notes there's no reason for the Jews to make, or for the Christians to make up a tomb story, as they were ready to embrace the shameful act that Jesus was crucified. They could easily just embrace the idea that he was thrown into a mass unmarked grave. In fact, as Jake Spencer Kennard remarked, that would actually bear fit with prophecy like Isaiah 53, that him being buried with criminals. So there's no reason for them to even make up the tomb story. So Dale Allison notes it's probably an historical memory. Now, I have additional arguments I could use, but I just don't have time to include them in my opening statement. Now, but even if I didn't have all this extra data, the Gospels are not questionable or guilty until proven innocent. We ought to treat them like we treat other ancient sources. In fact, I argue we should treat them like Ehrman treats Philo, as a valid historical source that shows, if granted, crucified victims could be buried. And that's all I'm asking we do, is we treat the Gospels like other ancient sources, innocent until proven guilty. So the burden is on the skeptic to prove they are guilty. The burden is not on me to prove they are innocent. Now, I suspect Jim will bring up differences in the Gospels, which he could argue are contradictions. He could bring up the character of Pilate, maybe he was argue he's a tyrant, or he could bring up his argument that the Sanhedrin unanimously condemned Jesus, which he uses to argue against Joseph of Arimathea's role. But I'll wait to see if he presents these to address those arguments later. And with that, I will conclude, and I will begin taking notes while Jim presents his side. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate you, brother. All right, Mr. Jim Majors, you're up for your 10-minute opening, man.
Hey, great. Thank you, Mike, for your opening. So to be completely honest with you, I don't have, I had a, oops, sorry. I had an opening statement prepared, but my laptop was compromised, so I do not have my presentation or anything like that. So I'm just going to be real with you guys. It's my belief that Jesus.
Like his audio's getting in and out.
Yeah. Jim, can you hear us? We can't hear you.
Jim, you there?
Oh, man.
Hold on.
I feel really bad. His presentation was lost, and now this is happening.
Yeah. Let me see if I can. Hold on, everyone. Let me get in contact with Jim real quick.
So I guess I will entertain while you do that. So, while we're waiting on Jim, how are things with the audience? I'm fine, if anyone was wondering. Cooped up at home, but I'm also an introvert, so I'm always cooped up at home.
Sorry, everyone. We're trying to get Jim back right now. So let me continue to get in contact with him, and hopefully he realizes that. Hope he continues with his statement.
I think he might just be talking and forgot.
Yeah. Hold on 1 second.
I apologize. Can you hear me now?
I hear you, man.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So there's good reason for people to believe that Jesus is a historical figure. The evidence leans heavily in favor of historicity. But is the tomb itself historical? Do we have good reason to believe that the tomb mentioned in the Gospels was actually the place that Jesus was buried, if he was buried at all? I can't decide that for you because nobody can be sure. We cannot be certain one way or another, and I think that is something that that most scholars would agree with, is that we cannot say with anything close to a degree of certainty that it is in fact historical, and for one simple reason. Where's the tomb? What tomb? Tonight, I'm presenting you with facts, with concise arguments, with a case that I base on facts. It's I know most of these people watching. I know my fan base, and I know Michael's fan base. I've seen in his comments and everything the caliber of people that he attracts, and I have full confidence that this audience here on the Gospel Truth has the capacity, the ability, and the intellectual integrity change your minds when presented with sufficient evidence. Um, but I encourage you to go just one step further, and I want you to scrutinize the information that not only Mike provides, but that I provide for you tonight. And I'd like to ask for you to do both you and I a favor. I'd like you to shift your perception of the tomb and everything surrounding the tomb into a neutral position. Just take it out of gear and just let it coast. And while you're coasting, I want you to analyze the data. I want you to do so without giving in to, or without giving any authority to your opinions prematurely. So if we can do that, then that'd be great. So with our minds aware of our own biases, let's talk about the tomb. The number one key piece of evidence supporting the historicity of the tomb is the tomb. That is the number one piece of evidence. To say it is the smoking gun is an understatement. Where is the tomb? Nobody can decide what the tomb is. The most popular one seems to be the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It's been venerated and held to be the site of Jesus's burial and be Jesus's tomb since about 325 during the reign of Constantine. It was actually his mother, Helena, Empress Helena, who went on a rampage. It's probably a slight exaggeration, but she went on a pious mission to establish holy sites. Churches popping up everywhere, and there's conflicting accounts as to how she discovered it. I've seen accounts where a person shared family tradition that was passed down over the years as to the location of the tomb, which checked out. I've heard of a bishop, Bishop Macarius, I believe, who led her to these places and kind of guided her on her expedition. But we're talking about 4th century. We're talking about early 4th century is our earliest evidence for the tomb. And scholars are very much so divided as to the location of the tomb. We know where the Garden of Gethsemane is. We've established the look of holy sites or places that were venerated by Second Temple Jews or by 1st century Christians or Jews. And I can't for the life of me come to an understanding of how the location of Jesus' tomb could go missing. But not just over time, but we're talking about in under 300 years, 3 centuries, the location of Jesus' tomb is just vanished, just gone. People blame it, on Hadrian coming in and building the temple to Apollo, I believe it is, or Venus. But yeah, that's the number one piece of evidence that we need. I mean, to claim that there is a tomb, we need evidence for that, and the gospel narratives cannot be that evidence. The reason they can't be that evidence is because they're unreliable, as in terms of trusting them to tell the truth without embellishing or interpolating something to solidify and progress their narrative. They misuse text. They misuse the Old Testament, mistranslate, misinterpret, misinform. There are inconsistencies in their individual accounts, especially accounts that seem to be highly mythologized, such as the tomb, the empty tomb, such as the birth narratives of Jesus. Very highly mythologized. A lot of ex eventu prophecy. I guess you could say, claimed second fulfillment prophecies happening there. How much time do I have left?
You have about, I think about 5 minutes left.
About 5 minutes. Cool. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between the gospels here, about these inconsistencies. People make a big deal, especially atheists. Atheists make a big deal about inconsistencies regarding the number of women who are at the tomb. I personally don't think that that's a huge deal. It's not really important for me. Yeah, it's very possible. I personally don't believe that's true. I don't believe that somebody would mention two separate Marys without mentioning a third Mary, much less other women, or why somebody would only mention one woman. The only thing that I can think of is that it makes sense because these are not accounts based on eyewitnesses. Who are the eyewitnesses to the tomb? You got Joseph of Arimathea. You've got Nicodemus. Both members, both of the Sanhedrin. Very high Jewish ruling. In fact, Nicodemus, I believe, was very high up in the rankings, if not the head honcho over there. And it has Josephus. Well, it has Nicodemus approaching Jesus before he dies, talking about how believe that you're the Messiah. We believe this. You know, we're rooting for you, Jesus. Team. And then you have Josephus coming in after Jesus has been crucified, been up there for a few hours, and beseeches Pilate to give him the body of Jesus. Yes, and Mike was absolutely right whenever he was referring to the Jewish burial practices and what they did or didn't allow. But the only problem with his argument is that he talked about how the different little subdivisions and breaking up of power and staying out of each other's business. Yeah, that's all well and good. But the thing is that this was in Pilate's backyard. Like literally, the trial was held on Pilate's porch. You could call it. That this was his home. And the fact of the matter is that whether or not there were Jews there and there's a Jewish temple there and so on and so forth, the fact of the matter is that the Romans ruled. What the Romans say goes. The Jews weren't part of another province. They weren't part of another jurisdiction. They were under the jurisdiction of Pilate. And if you don't think so, I mean, just look at the fact that they have to that they're nervous about asking Pilate to Jesus down. Like, really, is he going to kill you because you're just doing what tradition has always dictated? Like this is totally fine. Like what are you worried about, dude? And additionally, let's see. Damn it, why am I spacing out? Well, no, I'm spacing out. But yeah, so we don't have any accounts from the people who actually were witnesses to the tomb. So the women, the Marys, and while I'll give the benefit of the doubt and say Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, neither of which I personally believe were historical agents within this narrative. I believe it's possible that maybe they were. It is loosely based on historical figures or actual Sanhedrin members who were thought highly of, and maybe they still had a reputation, centuries later. But I personally don't believe that the insertion of them is anything more than a literary device meant to push an agenda. I'm going to go ahead and relinquish the rest of my time because I'm just going down rabbit holes.
All right. Thank you both for the opening statements. Now we're going to transition to a 5-minute rebuttal round. Mike, you're up for a 5-minute rebuttal.
Can I share my screen again in a minute, Marlon?
Yes.
No. Oh.
I just have one thing I want to show in a second here, but I want to address your first point. But I'll start my 5 minutes now if you guys want to go. I want to just let everyone know. Jim had a presentation set in his computer, had a whole catastrophe. So, I mean, it's unfortunate that happened, but I mean, there's a lot of arguments, that are for and against this. I don't want people to think this is, a pretty good presentation compared to what I'm trying to say. So I'm going to go and just address the points he gave us. So the first thing is he's questioning where is the tomb. With all due respect, I think we can give them a break on this one, considering the history. Josephus tells us in 70 AD, the Romans came in and utterly destroyed Jerusalem. The Christians relocated to Pella, the Jewish Christians mainly. The city was basically in ruins. About 60 years later, the Emperor Hadrian comes in and rebuilds a whole new city over top of it and wants to wipe out any memory of Judaism entirely. In fact, Jews were not even allowed in Jerusalem anymore except for one day of the year. So the descendants of that point, the descendants of the primary witnesses could not even go back into the city at that point. Christians were not even allowed to establish holy sites in Jerusalem until the 4th century. I think we can give them a little bit of a break here in losing track of the tomb. And also, we've lost track of a lot of things in history, like the capital city of Azak of the Parthian Empire. Entire kings were crowned there, yet we're not really sure where that city is. We lost the city of Akkad, Sargon's capital. So again, we lose stuff in archaeology all the time. That doesn't mean it didn't exist. I didn't even use the location of the tomb as part of my evidence. I don't even need it. I'm not even sure if what they venerate is the actual tomb. It's not important to me. I want to share my screen now. The second thing is he mentioned the Gospels are unreliable because there's inconsistencies in them. So here's a web page that goes over the accounts of Hannibal. It compares Polybius and Livy, Polybius being our earlier source and Livy being a later source. This is on Hannibal crossing the Alps. As you can see, if you skim through this a little bit, you can see Livy provides a lot more detail than Polybius does. Sometimes it's reversed, but for the most part, you get that. There are contradictions in these accounts. For example, Livy includes this giant long speech that he adds to give to Hannibal. He adds this thing in the beginning that some of Hannibal's men were a little upset about having to cross the Alps, so he had to have even this big speech to get them excited. Polybius doesn't mention that at all. Then you have that Polybius says they came to the Rhone and the Azakaras River, but if you look over here in Livy, it says the Sara and the Rhone. Later, it says they just settled a dispute for a local tribe called the Allobroges. They settled a dispute. Polybius, over on this side, down here, he says the Allobroges eventually came back and started attacking after they pretended to be allies of Hannibal. Livy didn't like this tension, so he edited them out. He just says they were attacked by random Gaelic tribes. So you can see there are contradictions in the account. Does any of this make you doubt the general thing they agree on, which is that Hannibal crossed the Alps? Most historians don't. In fact, if you read their accounts of Hannibal, they try to harmonize these accounts. Look for the things they agree on. Try to come up with rational explanations for why they disagree. So you can take my screen down now. That's all I had. I wanted to share. I just want to look at that. But we see a lot of times in historical accounts, we do see that there are contradictions between various people. And that's just expected. I mean, for example, this is, Gilbert Garahan in Guide to Historical Methods says almost any critical history that discusses the evidence for important statements will furnish examples of discrepant or contradictory accounts and the attempts which are made to reconcile them. So I've done something recently to look into this. I started looking into forensic files on eyewitness testimony. And no, I did not just go to J. Warner Wallace. I've actually been looking at, I requested a couple articles from the Florida Bar Journal recently. And we'll note is eyewitness testimonies tend to agree on the main facts if they're reliable, but they will always disagree on minor details. So, for example, attorney Milton Kilner says conflicting testimony is rarely the result of intentional falsehood, but is usually caused by honest differences of observation and recall. This is from the Florida Bar Journal, June 1981. In Eyewitness Testimony in Civil Criminal Law, Section 6-3, it says, jurors who succumb to the power of detailed testimony would probably be surprised to learn that, in fact, a witness's memory for details about peripheral matters may not be related on all of the witness's accuracy about the central aspects. So eyewitness testimonies tend to disagree on details. Ironically, the Gospels tend to match that. They get the general points in agreement, and they vary on certain details. They tend to match what we see with regards to eyewitness testimonies. So I don't think that's any reason to doubt what the Gospel tell us. It's multiply attested. There's plenty of evidence to support it, and I see no reason to deny the burial of Jesus in the tomb. For the same reason, I'm not going to deny that Hannibal crossed the Alps just because there's differences in it. Yeah, Hannibal crossing the Alps is rare. It only happened once, but that's no reason to deny it. And I think the evidence is clearly stacked in the Gospel's favor.
All right, thank you, Mike. All right, Jim, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal.
Okay, gotta unmute real quick. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well.
Okay, cool. Okay, so whenever Mike's talking about these inconsistencies, like, I mean, he's being very charitable in terms of examples of inconsistencies. The Gospels have such damning consistency that it would surely prove that the authors are not eyewitnesses, which is the scholarly consensus, that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. So I don't really know why anything about eyewitnesses would even apply to the Gospel authors, especially demonstrating that that we see this relationship between the text, and we see this development of theology, just molding it to their to their will, even to the point of matching events to make the puzzle that they want, often possibly discrediting an actual historical event, but I don't think that many of those cases are actually historical. But I do want to give one example. I don't know if you can read this, but this is Matthew 28:1. Okay, Matthew 28:1, and we're going to look at John chapter 20. Okay, these are the accounts of the women at the tomb. I chose Matthew and John because Mark has a short ending. Matthew used Mark. Mark is the earliest source, and I used John just because he's the gospel outside of the synopsis, to have the contrasting view of alleged eyewitness account. So in Matthew 28:1, Mary doesn't say anything about Jesus' body. You know, she gets there. There's an angel that descends. There's an earthquake. It rolls the stone away, and the angel tells Mary that he's risen. Go and tell the disciples to go to Galilee, and so you know, she does. But before she can get there, Jesus appears to her. But in John, whenever wait, hang on, one second, hang on, get my Bible. I don't trust myself. Okay. All right. So in John, Mary comes to the tomb. The stone's already rolled away, and she turns around and runs back, and she tells Simon Peter, and she tells the other disciple. So Simon Peter and the other disciple, they race back to the tomb, and I think the other disciple wins. Let's see. Yeah, the other disciple wins. So he gets there first. He stoops down, giving us justification to believe that it was a tomb with a very low cut door, because we see different claims that they had. And they turn around and they go back. They eventually they leave and they go back to the house. There's no angels that appear, nothing like that. So up until this point, you know, there's been no proclamation that Jesus has risen. It's just Mary over here freaking out, saying that they've taken Jesus' body. I don't know who, but she thinks that somebody took it. She obviously has somebody in mind. She says that they've taken my Lord's body, and I don't know where it is. I don't know where Jesus' body is. So of course the men come and check it out because women's testimony is held in high esteem. Oh yeah, and they find the little pieces of linen. So Mary's crying outside of the tomb, and she sees the gardener. It's actually Jesus, but she doesn't notice him. She doesn't realize that it's him because apparently he has a very forgettable face. Apparently, but he asked her, well, why are you crying? And she said, because they've taken my Lord's body, and I don't know where he is. Well, he makes himself known to her, and she's ecstatic. She's happy. And she runs and she announces this to the disciples. So why then in Matthew does the author have Mary staying at the tomb? She never leaves. There are let's see.
Hey Jim, that's time right there, Jim.
Oh, you didn't give me a minute warning. Okay. Mary does not see Jesus the same way that she's so in Matthew, Mary is aware that Jesus is risen, that he has gone to Galilee, but in John she's not. In John, she's scared. She's freaking out. She thinks somebody stole Jesus's body because there was no angel that announced it to her or anything like that. And Jesus appears to her in John and tells her, makes himself known. So and we don't see anything in Matthew about Mary crying or wondering where Jesus' body is. She's not mourning. She's not freaking out because there's an explanation. So that there's definitely reason to suggest that there's something going on with that. I really hate that I'm not better prepared, and I know it's not completely my fault, but I apologize.
All right, no problem, man. All right, fellas. So that's the rebuttal round. So now we're going to get to a 40-minute discussion between you two. And so I'm not sure who want to take the first crack at the questions, but
I have several questions, if that's okay. I can go first, unless Jim has questions.
Yeah, sure.
I'll let him go first. Okay.
I've got questions, but you go ahead and shoot, bro.
Sure. So what was Jesus crucified for? Why did the Romans crucify him, in your view?
He was crucified for the claim, whether it was him or somebody else made it, the claim to be the king of Israel or the king of the Jews. In fact, there's consistency across the Gospels that he was with a sign saying just that.
Interesting. So you agree that consistency across the Gospels means it's probably likely it was a true thing that took place, or a probable thing that took place. There's also consistency across the Gospels that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea.
Sure, but a consistency does not necessarily imply that it is historical. I mean, it can be borrowing from each other, so it can really just be one person making this claim and the other people mirroring their source.
So, but you said you accept that Jesus was crucified for being king of the Jews because and your reason is there's consistency across the Gospels, but you don't think the consistency across the Gospels is evidence Jesus was buried in the tomb.
Well, Jesus wasn't supposed to die as the Messiah. The current understanding, or the contemporary understanding amongst Jews, was that the Messiah was going to unite Israel and save them from persecution and oppression, and they'd all be returned to their land. so Jesus was not supposed to die if he was the Messiah. Hence, the extreme measures that the gospel authors go to in order to make him seem qualified to be the Messiah. It's like, okay, well, he didn't unite Israel, but maybe we can find some other things that could possibly be prophecies of the Messiah, or they could just be misunderstandings and mistranslations, but probably not.
Well, I mean, that's irrelevant to the main point I'm making. If there's if consistency across multiple sources indicates that it's likely this happened, then I would say the same thing would apply to the tomb. I don't see why we have to reject that.
Well, would you? I mean, do you also use that standard amongst other historical texts or ancient texts? Should I say?
Yeah, if the evidence shows it. Fine. Now, I will.
What do you mean if the evidence shows it? Like, we don't have evidence that there's a sign. There was a sign with the characters representing Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But there is some consistency. Now, granted, I believe in John it says that it was written in 3 languages, and I think the wording is a little bit different in Luke.
I mean,
but they do seem to agree on that general idea.
I mean, honestly, since I've read Mike Lacona's book, why there are differences since I've read Mike Lacona's book, why there are differences in the Gospels, I'm not really worried about differences like that, like I used to be. I don't think they necessarily have to be harmonized in that strong sense. So I'm perfectly fine with them trying to estimate that kind of stuff. But that's beside my main point. They do agree on the main facts of the story, which is that Jesus was crucified for being King of the Jews, buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea.
Sure, because it's a theme. Like that's the main theme. Like that's like if you are going to and it's under the sea and you dress up like a crab and everybody's looking at you weird and it's like, well, it fits. Like, you know, it goes with everything. Like there are central key themes, but I don't think that just because it appeals to the theme means that it also appeals to the likelihood of historicity. Like like when Mary returned to the disciples from the tomb, did she know that Jesus had risen?
I mean, I don't really know, and I don't really think that's important because that's regarding the empty tomb account. I'm just talking about the burial account at this point. Again, I'm perfectly
this account of the tomb
are spotlighting different women regarding the tomb. They're spotlighting, they're telling the different aspects of it. That's not going to bother me. I don't really see that as a major issue, though.
Well, because it's something that would be important to them that they would get accurately transmitted. I don't think that's something that they would want to be lackadaisical about if they were concerned with transmitting a historical account.
Do you think Caesar was assassinated by the Senate on the Ides of March?
No.
You don't think Julius Caesar was assassinated?
Yeah, I do think he was assassinated.
Okay. I mean,
do you think he became a god?
No, and let me. You agree that he was assassinated, but if you read the accounts,
there are textual witnesses.
There's what?
There are textual accounts of people witnessing in the pyre of his soul ascending.
So, I mean, again, I don't have to accept all miracle claims for the same reason you don't accept all miracle claims. It depends on the evidence. So again, I'm talking about the assassination. And you don't have to accept all. You're trying to change it to something I'm not. The debate is not if Jesus was buried in a tomb. I mean, I could end this debate by saying, he was buried in a tomb.
Well, I'm talking about the consistencies amongst the accounts. Like there are consistencies of eyewitnesses that Julius Caesar ascended into heaven on the pyre.
There are so many
that Vespasian performed miracles.
There are so many inconsistencies regarding the assassination of Caesar, how he died. Yeah, I mean, so for example, Plutarch says the conspirators gathered around him for petitions. Suetonius said conspirators gathered around him to pay respect. Plutarch says that Caesar did not cry out in violence before being stabbed. Suetonius said Caesar did crown violence for being stabbed. And I go down the list. There's so many things here about differences. I mean Nicholas Horsfall writes, on the Ides, more varied than any abundant information survives, I believe, than more than any other thing in Roman and Greek history. There's so many inconsistencies.
Sure.
Does any of the factor inconsistencies in the account make
and there's always a reason.
Okay.
Well, there's reasons for inconsistencies, whether it's lazy scribal work or poor scribal work, or if it's interpolation, or if it's malicious editing. There's so many reasons for there to be inconsistencies, and one of those reasons is that they weren't eyewitnesses, or that they it's not a historical account. Like, I don't see Jesus, John having Mary go to the apostle, go to the disciples, freaking out, saying, "I can't find Jesus. They took his body." When in Matthew, Mary goes to the tomb, the angels say, "Hey, he's risen. He's gone to Galilee. Don't be afraid. Like, his body was here, now it's gone." And then John, she's a blubbering mess. She looks like one of those waiting room ladies on House.
Okay, again, that doesn't mean they're wrong on the general themes. For the same reason, Caesar was definitely assassinated by the Senate on the Ides of March. Even on the general, what do you mean?
Right. But we can get more specific. And we can say, is it historical that Mary told the disciples that Jesus, that the tomb is empty?
Okay, let's just say right now, I'm willing to give you all that. Again, for the same reasons Mike Licona doesn't spend too much time on and says that the authors are spotlighting, and he admits there are contradictions here, yet he still believes the resurrection happened. I'm willing to give you all that for the sake of this debate. That does not mean Jesus was not buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. For the same reason, the fact that Plutarch and Suetonius disagree on the assassination of Caesar on various minor details, that doesn't mean Caesar was not assassinated. That it was just a mythic invention.
Well, where's Joseph of Arimathea's body? Where was he buried?
I have no clue, for the same reason I don't know where Sargon of Akkad was buried.
Okay. Do we have? Well, first of all, it'd be much more likely that he would have been buried in Arimathea rather than Jerusalem. I mean, unless he had been there for a generation or so. But I mean, even so, we would expect him to have family buried with him, as was custom. Do we have any evidence of people being buried in the tomb?
We don't even know where. I mean, I'm willing to admit we don't know exactly where the tomb of Jesus was, for the reasons I gave in my rebuttal.
Yes. Right. Well, not just where it is. I mean, we have a general idea if the gospel accounts are to be held with any high degree of trust, but it doesn't get us anywhere in the ballpark of definitively saying this. This right here is the tomb of Jesus. As a matter of fact, I found 3 crosses in there, and going to spruce this place up and build a church on top of it.
Again, I really don't see what that has to do with anything. I mean, Jody Magnus, for example, who's an expert on Jewish burials, says, and I quote, "Not a single undisturbed tomb in Jerusalem has ever been discovered, with one exception, and excavated by archaeologists. This means that even in the cases where tombs or ossuaries still contain the original physical remains, the skeletons are often disturbed, damaged, or incomplete." So she notes that a lot of the tombs, they first of all, they can't excavate due to political reasons, and a lot of the ones they have to work with are incomplete or damaged, and they can't really always piece everything together. That's just how archaeology works sometimes. I mean, we're not going to be able to find Joseph of Arimathea's body, let alone his family, or, that I would even argue the tomb of Jesus, considering what happened in Jerusalem in the following years.
Oh, I don't see what that has to do with anything, because it lasted for a period of just a few years, and the Jews somehow managed to be able to locate all of their holy sites, even after being cast out for much longer than the Christians were. But William Lane Craig says that. William Lane Craig talks about that during Jesus' time, there was always pilgrimages to Jerusalem. There was an extraordinary interest in the graves of Jewish martyrs, and they were attended to and cared for and adorned and graffitied on. Raymond Brown says that there was a period where Jewish veneration was increased, particularly of the tombs of the martyrs and the prophets. I'm sorry.
Question about that. Do you believe the site that is venerated as Abraham's burial place is actually where Abraham was buried?
I don't believe Abraham is a historical figure.
Okay, then it's this. I mean, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. If they have a tomb, well, how can we be really sure if it really was that location? If they don't have a tomb, well, why don't they have a tomb? You can make the same case for if it was Jesus's tomb, because they do have a location they use quite often. I mean, and skeptics say, well, we're not really sure if that is a tomb. Just like they say that's not really sure if that's where Abraham was buried, because a lot of them don't believe Abraham existed. Again, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. That's why it was not even part of my original case in my opening statement.
But why wouldn't it be venerated, especially at a time when pilgrimages were being made to the site? And I just want to say that quite possibly started the first tourist business, because with his mom establishing all of these ribbon cutting ceremonies of holy sites across Palestine, across the whole area. Bethlehem, in Nazareth, in a field, in the shepherd's field. They took the damn shepherd's field from them. Venerated that sucker. Venerated the Holy Sepulchre. Venerated a church next to it. Over the centuries, there were so many churches. There was even a church in Egypt where they claimed that Jesus and Mary stayed the night whenever they were hiding from Herod.
Do you think Jesus really stayed at that place?
And you and I both know. I mean, let's level here, man. Like, you and I both know that's not historical, right? Like, we know that those are not sites. Like, those were not traditionally emitted from the source. Like, they are late transmissions that may be consistent up until now. Like the Holy Sepulchre site, yeah, from the early 4th until now. Yeah, there's been a consistent interest or a consistent claim amongst a group of people that this is the tomb of Jesus. But at the same time, there's also been other claims of other tombs, and everything that we've seen and everything that we've examined at the Holy Sepulchre site just leads us further and further from the possibility of that being Jesus's tomb, or where Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, which I don't know if you want to get into it, but there's a very strong possibility that it was just a temporary tomb, just for the Sabbath, for the special Sabbath, and that it would have been moved the following night. After the Sabbath was up, of course.
Going back to one of your points. I mean, you mentioned all these Christian holy sites. Do you think that Jesus actually stayed at this house in Egypt?
No.
Okay, so if the Christians had a tomb, are you going to necessarily believe them for the very same reasons? Like, let's say they were venerating it. They somehow got permission from Hadrian to keep venerating a tomb in Jerusalem. Okay, damned if they do, damned if they don't.
Reasons.
Where's the tomb?
No, not at all for the same reasons. Firstly, I don't believe that Jesus stayed at that house in Egypt because of the conflicting narratives between Matthew and Luke. Luke not even mentioning going to Egypt. None of the Gospels do. It's a strictly Matthew thing. And on top of that, there's the additional inconsistency with Jesus' circumcision, presence at the temple, and return to Galilee, to Nazareth. There's many reasons for me to not believe, but none of those reasons are the reasons that I don't believe that the tomb is historical.
Okay, this goes back to my main point. You said, where's the tomb? Okay, well, Christians have been venerating a tomb since they were allowed to, which is in the 4th century. You don't think that was the actual burial of Jesus. But I asked you about these other sites, and you said, well, no, I don't trust those as well, for the same reason you don't trust that the burial place of Abraham means Abraham was actually buried there. So even if they had a site they were venerating, let's say Hadrian, there's a source in regarding Hadrian, where some Christians in the 2nd, 3rd century were like, luckily Hadrian lets us still venerate the tomb. Does that mean you're just going to be like, oh, yeah, they definitely had a location of the tomb and it's been the same place for the centuries?
Yeah, and in fact, both Epiphanius and Eusebius write. They are, I guess, transmitting the account of Aquila, who says that when Hadrian arrived in Jerusalem, that there was a flourishing, just a present population, but a flourishing population of disciples of the apostles.
Okay, and so flourish, keep going. What does that have to do with the tomb, though?
And there was a church that is mentioned on that site. So it already shows that the presence of a Christian community when Hadrian arrives in Jerusalem, and of course it's Aquila's writing long after this, and of course Epiphanius and Eusebius are writing long after this. But regardless, it still shows that that the population was there despite the destruction of Jerusalem. The claim that all left and went to a certain location, scholars are more and more turning against that, because I mean there's just an early Jewish oral tradition. That it's not historical. It's very I'd say it's highly probable. It's more probable that it's not historical.
Point here. I mean, you don't think there was a tomb for them to venerate at that time. So, and my basic point I'm trying to get at is that even if there were other sources saying that they had a location they were venerating, I don't think you would necessarily accept that for the same reason you don't accept the site they chose for Abraham's place would necessarily be, that proves that Abraham was actually buried there. I mean, so when let's go back to your original.
Well, sure, I would have more. I would be much more likely. In fact, I would be very likely to believe that Jesus was buried in it for however long period of time, whether it was temporary or not. Because I just want to say, conceding that Jesus was buried in the tomb is not conceding that Jesus rose from the dead. Let me just go ahead and put that out there before everybody flips their wig.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, exactly. Well, and it doesn't follow.
Right, we're just talking about the tomb thing.
So if Jesus was buried in the tomb, hang on, we'll just give me just real quick. If Jesus was buried in the tomb, regardless of where it was, whatever, if there was an early evidence of any sort of reverence for this site, any sort of textual account of this site, where it was any of the hundreds of leaders who went through Jerusalem, went to all these sites and wrote about them. We don't see anything about the tomb until the 4th century. So that's why I have a problem with it, is because it's curious enough that also in the 4th century, we also see a bunch of other sites come up that are traditional sites of certain things happening. That you and I both know is just a pious, I guess, a marketing scheme of Empress Helena.
That's fine, but okay, let's just move on. I feel like we're not getting anywhere. What is the reason for the Christians to make up the entombment story? Like, why did they have to make this up? Why couldn't they just have Jesus buried?
Sure. Okay, so I already talked about how Jesus wasn't supposed to die, so they had to give him certain certain experience. They had to fake the resume just a little bit, and part of that resume was Isaiah 53. Being buried in a rich man's grave, and only rich people at the time. Well, I won't say only rich, but it was way more common for the rich people to be able to afford and to have the land to be able to have an actual hewn from rock tomb, like Jesus is described, like a solarium, like a kind of like a table, inside of a recess, instead of like the ones that we see, like the alleged tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, or the tombs under the Holy Sepulchre that are actually cooking.
I mean, like later Mishnah law talks about how the Sanhedrin had to have sort of like graves for these people. Like they would have graves for people that were strangled, beheaded, burned, and so they had graves ready to go. So
they had potter's fields. They had whole fields, which were more like trenches. That after they were burned or stoned,
you would also agree with me. These prophecies are kind of vague, and they can be loose in how they are interpreted.
Sure, yeah, but we don't have very many actual court proceedings of or eyewitness accounts, reliable eyewitness accounts of executions. That's just something we don't have. It's just the same reason that we don't have any archaeological evidence for the crucified. Whether or not the vast majority were left on the cross until they were taken off by nature and its elements. Whether or not that's historical, people just didn't write about it that much. Josephus only writes about it because Josephus only writes about it because his friend's involved, because he saves his friend's life. That's the only reason Josephus is writing about it. If he would have kept writing.
Why couldn't they just have Jesus buried in like a grave that was just set aside for the Sanhedrin for criminals? I mean, J. Kentard Spenard says if Christianity had fashioned the entombment on the basis of prophecy, it would have left the body with the corpses of other criminals. And that's what Isaiah 53:9 even says, that he was buried with the wicked. I mean, they could just have had him thrown into this mass grave that the Sanhedrin had set aside. And then guess what? Matthew was crafting a myth. He could have worked with that, because what happens at Jesus' death? Tombs open up and people rise. Well, they could have just had the same thing when he rose from the dead. Everyone in the mass grave could have risen up if they're just crafting myths. Why do they have? I don't see why they have to necessarily invent an entombment story.
So I did a fairly deep dive as far as exegetical dive into the Isaiah 53:9. And it seems to me whenever it's talking about being assigned a grave with the wicked, means that he was given the same sentence as bad people, the thieves, the impenitent and the penitent thief, or the both penitents, or only one penitent, whatever it is. But he was innocent and was given the same treatment as the wicked.
Okay, I mean, yeah. Why couldn't they just have him being thrown in the same grave with the thieves he was crucified with? I don't see why they have to craft this whole entombment story. It's not necessary for their movement. I mean, the whole Christian message that they embrace the humiliation of crucifixion. Dale Allison says, "Are we to believe that Christians who acknowledge the humiliation of crucifixion were somehow unable to allow that Jesus was denied a decent burial, as though the latter was more dreadful than the former?"
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, in that verse that they're using, that very same verse that talks about being assigned the grave of the wicked, is that he was buried in a rich man's grave, and which would be a rock hewn tomb. I mean, I guess they could have maybe lined a mass grave with some like gold plating or something like that, bling it out a little bit. But no, when they're talking about a rich man's grave, it makes sense that they would use a tomb in the narratives.
Basically it says Isaiah 53:9, and they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death.
Yes.
So again, it doesn't say he was buried with the rich. Again, as you and I agree, these prophecies are vague. You can interpret them in so many different ways, and I'm perfectly fine admitting that. So they made his grave
not with the
rich man in his death.
Right. Well, not with the rich, as in like buried like with a rich person, but buried in the same manner as rich people. But he was assigned assigned the same as the wicked, and that being a criminal's disposal. Which was normal, was common. I mean, the disposal of just under some dirt, even by the Jews. It's like you were talking about. They were worried about the consecration, maintaining the sanctity of the soil, and the whole surrounding area. In fact, it talks about whenever you kill something, kick some dirt over on top of it. It has to be. It doesn't have to be in a tomb. It doesn't have to be with anything nice. It just has to be covered.
So, again, let's just look at the prophecy. They made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man of his death. Mishnah law says that the Sanhedrin had to basically have some sort of grave for these criminals to throw them into. The strangled, Jody Magnus talks about the strangled, the beheaded, the burned. They had to have a grave. I think this prophecy working just fine with a mass grave they could have just thrown him into. It's just because, the rich have sort of provided this grave for him, and he's buried with the wicked. This is why Dale Allison and Spencer Kenner note there's no reason for them to craft this whole entombment story.
Well, sure there is. What would you be more inclined to believe that if you were inclined to believe that people were to rise from the dead? Would you believe that that somebody had a friend who died and then they rose from the dead after they were buried in a tomb, and then somebody else says that they had a friend who died appeared to them after they were buried in a mass grave? Which more likely and more infallible, so to speak? Because like with a tomb, it's like, well, he's either there or he's not. With a mass grave, it's like you're looking and you're like, get a shovel. Like, where do we start?
Do you think the Gospels were written in Judea or in Jerusalem?
I'm sorry?
Well, do you think the Gospels...
What'd you say?
I mean, it sounds like you're kind of admitting that they were used for apologetic purposes here to actually try to convince people. Like, the empty tomb was actually something they were trying to convince people of.
It was used for apologetics purposes, but I'm not saying that the historicity, that the historical events are being used for apologetic reasons. What I'm saying is that there are fabrications and embellishments for the purpose of apologetics.
Okay, so do you think the Gospels were written before 70 AD?
Possibly Mark, but the rest of them, no.
Okay, so let's just say Mark then. Do you think Mark was written in Jerusalem?
No.
Okay, so, I mean, you said one time, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you said the Gospels are basically fan fiction. If you're making fan fiction, you're not trying to convince anyone. You're just trying to... You're trying to just make stories
just
up.
Cleared up. Just cleared up. I was not speaking in an academic tone. I was not or setting. It was definitely hyperbolic. It was just for funsies.
Okay, that's fine. But I'm just trying to get why they had to craft the tomb story. I mean, they rely. I mean, Acts, for example, Acts mentions prophecy. They mention all the witnesses with them. If Mark was not necessarily written in Judea, maybe they couldn't check the tomb kind of thing. Now, I think there are good evidences for the empty tomb, which, not the subject of this debate, but why couldn't they just have Jesus thrown in a mass grave and then they could have said, go look at the field where he was buried. You won't find his body there. In fact, you won't find any bodies because when he resurrected, just like when he died, all the tombs are empty and he came out with everyone in the grave and they all went out.
Well, no, they all went in.
Well, into Jerusalem, but you get my point. Out of the grave.
Yeah. Well, there's actually two earthquakes, and 2 or 3 days apart, depending on how many days you think Jesus was in the tomb. You have an earthquake when Jesus dies, which is the one that splits the veil, and then you have another earthquake whenever when Mary arrives at the tomb. And the angel descends and rolls away the stone. There's an earthquake then, whether it's the angel causing the earthquake to roll the stone or whatever. There's a claim of an earthquake, which is only in Matthew, as well as the claim that the saints came out of the grave, because the way it seems to be portraying it is that the first earthquake woke them up, and then the second one made them get out of their grave and actually go into Jerusalem.
So I don't see I didn't even bring up the earthquake. I don't see what that has to do with anything here. I'm just talking about why they had to invent the tomb.
Why did they have to have the saints come out of the graves?
well, maybe the report. Well, either Michael Kona's right, and that's just typical language you would use of the day, or maybe that's actually happened. I mean, he's just reporting what has been handed down.
Well, if it's typical language, if it's typical language, what is it a representation for? Like how do we interpret that? Or how, culturally, or in a contemporary setting, like looking at from like a position of authorship, what message do you think that the author of Matthew was trying to convey with that?
I mean, that's a whole different subject. That's not really important. You can read Michael Kona on that, or you can read other scholars. I'm just talking about naturally the whole teaching itself. I don't see why they had to invent the whole thing. This is one of what Dale Allison talked about extensively in his.
It's very possible, and this is just a supposition. This is just winging it. I'm trying to put myself in Matthew's shoes, thinking, man, in Mark.
Did we lose Jim? I can't hear him anymore. Jim? Did I lose? Hello?
Nah, you're there. I hear you. It looked like Jim dropped out.
Jim dropped out. Okay. I'm getting confused.
Yeah, Jim dropped out. Let me...
So how were things, Marlon?
Things were great, man. Things were great. That's great discussion so far.
How about that Rona?
Rona, man.
I think it's very possible that Matthew was trying to fix a gap in Mark's account as to how did the stone get rolled away. So it's very possible that Matthew came up with this idea of like, okay, it was an earthquake, or it was an angel that descended in and rolled it away. Whereas in every other narrative, there's no angel descending. The angels either pop up inside of the tomb next to them, or they resemble young boys and they're sitting inside. So maybe it's very possible that Matthew created it as a means of explanation, which lends credence to my claim that that's exactly what the gospel authors did, is that they answered questions that people had that they'd asked for decades. When's Jesus coming back? Didn't he say he was gonna be? He said he was gonna be here, and like. They're like, oh my gosh, like I just got a text from Jesus. He said that he's gonna go get some cigarettes and he'll be right back. It's just just winging it. Like that's just possibility, but it is a motive.
Well,
again, I don't really see what the empty tomb has to do with the fact that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Again, for the sake of the debate, I'm willing to give you that there are contradictions in there. There's, Michael Licona addresses this in his book, while there are differences in the Gospels. That's entirely different. I'm just talking about the general claim that Jesus was buried in a tomb.
Right. So which one of them are actual witnesses to the tomb? Which Gospel author?
I don't have to necessarily even say they are, for the same reason I don't have to say Polybius was a witness to the Second Punic War, and yet he's accurately reporting things. Or Suetonius is actually reporting the Ides of March.
I agree.
So
right,
then,
I agree, but just because it doesn't have to be them, that doesn't mean that it doesn't change their authority or the level of trust that I should put in their works, because, you weren't an eyewitness. Okay, well, then I need to ask some questions. Where are you getting this? And how do I know that you're getting this from a reliable source? You know what I mean? And with extreme claims, of course, I'm sure you're tired of hearing it, your ears are bleeding, but requires, extreme evidence.
Okay. Again, you said early on, you agree that the multiple attestation regarding Jesus' trial, regarding him being tried for being king of the Jews, was enough to convince you Jesus was tried for being king of the Jews. Why is it not enough to convince you he was actually buried in a tomb?
Not his trial, but of the presence of the sign humiliating him.
The sign on top of the cross,
but it's not the consistency that alone that does it for me. Like there are other factors that go into play. I mean, I don't think any of us believe anything because of just one thing. I think we all have a comprehensive case
We got about 7 or 8 minutes left.
for
So
why
why
we
don't you give
believe
me
what we
some other
believe.
reasons for believing? So give me a couple other reasons why you think, other than multiple attestation, why was Jesus crucified for being King of the Jews?
Well, I mean, either he was saying it or somebody else was. The way that especially like Mark writes, Jesus doesn't want people to know. You know, he's very much trying to keep it under wraps. But as the narrative progresses, as the years go on and other gospels are put out, we see this relationship between the gospels turn into more of an evolution of the theology, and if not interpolation, but in outright embellishment.
Okay, embellishments in the Gospels. Okay, what is that? Is that evidence that Jesus was crucified for being King of the Jews?
Well, what do you mean?
Okay, let's go back. Let me just recap.
Are we talking about the
I asked
crucifixion?
you.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just recap. Let's try to bring you up to speed. I asked you, how do you know Jesus
Sure.
was crucified for being King of the Jews? You said early on, it's multiply attested across the Gospels. I said, well, gee, it's also multiply attested across the Gospels as Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Why don't you doubt?
Sure.
Why don't you agree on that too? And you said, well, there are additional reasons I agree, or I would use to argue Jesus was tried for insurrection or being King of the Jews. Then I said, give me some of those additional reasons other than multiple attestation. Go.
So for the crucifixion, I think it's historical because if they were trying to explain the death of their revered teacher.
Hold on. That is not what I said.
I'm sorry.
I'm specifically saying Jesus was crucified for insurrection or being King of the Jews. Thieves were crucified. How do we know Jesus wasn't just crucified for being a thief? Sure. I mean, so I'm saying I want to know, what is your reasons for thinking Jesus was crucified for insurrection or being King of the Jews?
Because it doesn't have a lot of explanatory power, because it doesn't make sense that that the authors would portray him as breaking the law of a claim as King of the Jews instead of something amazing like turning all of Pilate's robes pink. Or something like that, like a big show of power, but instead it's just this claim of people are saying, there's a rumor going around and the old Jewish people are pissed off about it, so we got to do something about that. Is this true? Yeah, that seems like it's very, very possible. This was like, first of all, there's a high prior probability. Romans were very, very known for not only executing people who made them look bad or tried to one-up them or tried to take their throne away, but they would make damn sure that nobody else would do that afterwards and make an example of them, which is one of the many reasons that I don't believe that Jesus that Pilate would have permitted anybody to take Jesus's body. And there's plenty of textual evidence backing up that the Romans and the Jews didn't see eye to eye as far as to the imperative nature of getting somebody in the dirt before the sun went down.
Okay, so what are the sources that say Pilate would not have allowed a burial?
Well, not just Pilate, but Roman rules, and it doesn't say that they wouldn't, but that they didn't have to if they didn't want to. It says that they permitted people to take it, and I'll also add that it says that they permitted family members to take it. So in this case, it does seem very strange that a member of the council that begged Pilate so hard to crucify this guy. They voted was one of the voters voted yes, kill Jesus, would then go to Pilate and say, hey, you remember that dude I sent to you? Can I get him back? Like, I need to do some stuff.
Yeah, burial. I mean, we have other sources like Josephus and Philo that say that they were allowed to keep their laws or bury people. I don't see why Pilate would not allow this. And if we want to talk about the
Why is
character of Pilate and
Josephus
Josephus,
then portrayed as Joseph of Arimathea then portrayed as being nervous and frightened before he asked Pilate for the body?
well, apart from describing motives of someone, he could very well have been nervous about other Sanhedrin knowing about it. He could have been nervous about other reasons related to that. I mean, it just says he was nervous. It doesn't tell us why, though. But what we do know is the sources do agree that he buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. I see no reason to deny that from presuppositions. I mean, if we're just going to make up stories that we have no sources for, let's just say Jesus was crucified for thievery. When he threw out the money changers in the temple, he also took out a bunch of sacred artifacts from the temple. The Sanhedrin was very upset about that. They had him crucified. That's why he was crucified between two thieves. And, just because he was crucified for thievery, well, they would have allowed a burial. I mean, if we're just going to make up things for which we have no sources for, why not that?
But if that was the case, then why the presence of the sign that says Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews?
Well, that was clearly, as you said, there was embellishments. The gospel authors couldn't handle the fact that Jesus was killed for just thievery. They had to make up some bigger claim.
Yeah, I do think that some of that, like some of the attempt to make Jesus seem like this crucified king, like the purple robe, casting lots, dividing his garments, the crown of thorns, all these things. I think those are all literary interpolations and embellishments. But I think Jesus was flogged. I think he was tortured. I think that he was crucified. I see no reason why they would lie and say that Jesus was being convicted of being of the claim of being king of the Jews when in fact he stole something from the temple. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, I'm just pointing out, are we going to make up theories for which we have no evidence for? I mean, let's do it with Hannibal. I don't think Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants. That seems unreasonable. The Carthaginians were masters at the sea, clearly from the First Punic War. Therefore, he probably sailed along the European coast and landed in Europe. That makes more sense. I'm just going to make up something for which we have no textual evidence for. Why would we do that when there's no reason to deny the fact that we have multiple accusations for the tomb?
Well, I mean, let's think about that though. Like, let's genuinely think about what motive could somebody have? Like, what could somebody get out of doing that? I mean, for what reason would they have to do it? I mean, because I can for everything that I think is historical, I can give you a reason for it, and either it's obviously something that they took from the Old Testament, or it's not any part of creed or an early oral tradition. I'm not a big advocate of arguing from prophecy because I agree they were vague on purpose. I mean, 1 Corinthians said if the archons, the rulers of the world, had not known, they would not have crucified the Lord. I mean, the prophecies were vague on purpose. It's supposed to be this big mystery until it was finally revealed, kind of thing. You could look at a lot of passages. I mean, it's not that vague. It's not that vague. I mean, in Isaiah 7. God tells King Ahaz that God is going to send him somebody who's going to help him with this little sand going on, being stuck between the north and the south. They're wanting him to join their side, to getting pulled back and forth and getting threatened. Well, I'll kill you if you join his side. And right, send a baby by the time that he's of age. Everything will be fine. But that's supposedly about Jesus. That's made to be about Jesus. It is not so vague that it doesn't have a timestamp.
All right, guys, all right, we're going to conclude this portion of the debate. Thank you for a great discussion. Now we're going to transition to our closing statements. We got 5-minute closings. So, Mike Jones, you're up, man, for your 5-minute closing.
Yeah, just to quickly address that point. Open wrote an article, did the New Testament misquote the Old Testament? In Isaiah 7 is about something that happened relevant in the Old Testament. It's not necessarily about Jesus. Yes. This is about Jesus reenacting the Old Testament. They reapplied prophecies to Jesus on purpose. This was part of the cultural context. Again, I don't put that much emphasis on prophecy. It was never part of my original argument, and that's not even. I don't even bring up prophecy in my older resurrection series. So yeah, that's not really my main argument here. Hold on, let me finish my opening statement. You can respond then. I'm sorry. Yeah, we have tons of evidence to suggest that Jesus was actually buried in the tomb. Again, recap. The Digesta says those that condemn to death could be buried if it was requested and granted. Secondary evidence. Quintillan's secondary evidence saying attributed to Quintillan says someone on a cross could be buried if they were pierced. Philo says crucified people were buried in Egypt because the governor allowed it. Josephus says a Jew is buried crucified victim. Archaeological evidence in two sources, two examples, Johanan and Antigonus, the last Hasmonean king, were crucified and they were allowed to be buried. Jewish sources express the importance of burying bodies. Philo and Josephus record Rome did allow to keep their sacred customs and rituals. And in fact, Philo notes Tiberius scolded Pilate on this, allowing them to keep their laws. Tomb of Jesus is multiply attested. It's consistent with standard Jewish burial practices, and there's no competing traditions here. It's clearly stacked in that favor. And again, I would refer people to eyewitness testimonies, like the sources I mentioned earlier. Just because there are differences in the way the accounts are given, that doesn't mean they're false or they're wrong on the general points. In fact, it's consistent with what we would expect on eyewitness testimony being handed down to the authors like Mark and Luke, for example. There's no reason to deny this. If you want a pretty good example, just a popular example, go to Netflix's Unsolved Mysteries, Episode 2. They mention the fact that there were two witnesses to an event. First witness saw a blue Chevy Illumina outside of the hair salon, and a woman with shoulder-length hair. The second witness saw a blue Ford Taurus or a Malibu and a man with shoulder-length hair. Now, Michael Posley, the special agent of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation on the case, says, and I quote, "These witnesses are credible because they essentially saw the same thing and are totally independent of her." So he says witnesses regarding an event are credible even though they have contradictions in their account. Experts on eyewitness testimony don't say eyewitness testimony is unreliable just because they vary on minor details. That's what we would expect. That's what we see in every eyewitness testimony, as I note in the book From Memory to History. It just is what we get constantly with regards to eyewitness testimony. I don't see that as any evidence Jesus wasn't buried. We have plenty of evidence that Jesus was buried in a tomb. And once again, the Gospels are not guilty until proven innocent. Jim accepts that Jesus was most likely baptized by John the Baptist, even though those accounts have differences. He accepts Jesus was crucified for being king of the Jews, even though those accounts have differences. Why not the burial? This is not something miraculous. This is just Jesus was buried in a tomb. There's no reason for the Christians to invent it. They could have had Jesus thrown into a mass grave, and they could have named the field and then said, and all the bodies rose up with Jesus, just like when he died, all the tombs were empty. There's no reason for them to invent the tomb there. It's just part of the history, as Dale Allison notes. It's an historical memory handed down. So, again, why are the Gospels always questioned more than other historical sources? I've never understood this. If you want more, I recommend reading Resurrecting Jesus by Dale Allison. I don't agree with everything he says, but he gives a lot of good arguments for the burial of Jesus. So, I mean, I don't know what else to say. I think the evidence is clearly stacked to indicate Jesus was buried. Again, this is a non-miraculous account. I don't see why this has to be up for such high debate. I will say I think Jim is a very intelligent person. He didn't bring up any of the dumb arguments like, oh, well, Arimathea is called best disciple town, which I'm sure he would agree with me is not a good argument. But, I mean, I enjoyed the conversation. I'm glad we had it, and I'll concede the rest of my time.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate you. All right, Jim, you're up for your 5-minute closing, man.
Thanks so much. Mike, just going to say the feeling is mutual, completely reciprocal. Why the tomb? Why would they just make it up? Because it serves a purpose. Everything that they make up, everything that is embellished upon, it's embellished for a reason, either to make it more convincing or to introduce a new character or event that they can use as a segue into something else that they have. But it's not miraculous like just the tomb, but we're not talking. But when we're talking about the inconsistencies about the tomb, miraculous. If you think about it, the angels descending, how many angels are there? Is there one boy? Is there one angel? Is there two angels? Is there two men? And why the change? Well, of course, you might say, well, just because they say that there was only one doesn't mean that there wasn't another one. Well, sure, but if they say that there's one seated inside the tomb, the next one says that they ascend from heaven, roll back the stone, and sit on top of the stone outside of the tomb. Another one says that they're not there at all when they arrive at the tomb. They go inside enough to look around and know that Jesus isn't there, and then poof, right there next to them. Those are not small inconsistencies, but they are miraculous. If you look at the other inconsistencies in the tomb narrative, they're miraculous as well. I mean, all the way down to who moved the stone. In Mark, the women are wondering, well, who's going to move it for us? Matthew answers that question with what? With a miracle. With Jesus arising. If Mary didn't go and get the disciples, if Peter and the other disciple didn't race back to the tomb to confirm Mary, then it would just be women who knew about the tomb, and Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, none of which leave us any counts. Why? And additionally, why is there no transmission of the location of the tomb? Well, why is that not a highly venerated site, especially when there are communities of Christians there in Jerusalem that stuck it out with the Jews? They didn't all leave. Sure, some of them left. Quite a few of them left. People with small children, with families, but there were people who stayed and fought, and they would maintain their traditions, their house churches. What we have inscriptions and graffiti and all kinds of archaeological evidence for the presence of Christian communities through the Jewish wars. With being said is, I mean, the topic of the debate is, was Jesus buried in a tomb? I don't know. Do you have a tomb? Like, is there a tomb that we can examine? We can look at the descriptions in the Gospels and put it up against it and see if perhaps this is it, or maybe date the limestone, or date something that would place it around the early to mid first century, because it was supposed to be a new tomb that Joseph of Arimathea made for himself. I mean, that there has to be something that we can weigh this textual evidence, because when the textual evidence is so full of embellishment and changes for personal gratification, they're not. These are not people teaching history. These are people preaching mystery. It's not. It wasn't meant to be historical, and we shouldn't accept it as historical. And we sure shouldn't give it the of reign that we would give something that would claim to be authoritative or to claim to be historical. There's just no good reason to suggest it. Jesus was poor. Joseph of Arimathea voted to kill him. Why would he give him his tomb, especially when in some of the accounts it seems like Joseph of Arimathea was a Jesus follower when Jesus's followers weren't Jesus followers. It's I don't know. There's a lot of holes, way too many holes for me to say, yeah, Jesus was probably buried in a tomb. Right now, it seems the most reasonable thing to say is, no, we don't have sufficient evidence to suggest that Jesus was born in a tomb. And thank you guys so much, both the moderator and my interlocutor. You were both a pleasure.
All right, thank you guys both for those closing remarks. Thank you for the overall debate, man.
Thank you.
Good stuff, fellas. Good job. So we do have a whole bunch of questions that came in, so we're going to jump right into these questions. Here's the first one for you, Mike. You'll see the question pop at the bottom of the screen. It's almost there.
You just tell me.
All right. All right. Here's my question of Michael. Do you know of any scholarly books written by a historian that talks about the likelihood of someone being buried in a tomb if they were executed by the Romans?
I mean, he talks a lot of this in his books. He responds to Ehrman a lot on this. So he talks about the likelihood. Dale Allison, again, the book I mentioned, also talks about it. So check out that kind of works. The specific book, Jesus, Skepticism, and the Problem of History, Criterion, Context, and the Study of Christian Origins. That's where Craig Evans has a chapter in there. You can also see some of his other works. And I would recommend the book by Dale Allison. He's got a whole section on the whole burial of Jesus thing. And so they cover a lot of that. Again, the likelihood on the likelihood of if Jesus on someone being buried, I mean, it's very hard to calculate. We do have evidence that the Romans did allow that at times. We do have evidence that they let some people were on crosses instead. It depended on what was going on in each province with each ruler. It varied. It just the way it was. Just for example, give an analogy. I mean, Claudius or Suetonius tells us that under Claudius, Jews weren't allowed in Rome. Well, it was different under Nero. It just depended on what each other ruler decided.
Well, may I add something?
Go ahead, Jim.
It's also important to see that it wasn't just about Pilate allowing them to bury Jesus in a tomb. Where Jesus was buried wouldn't have been a concern for Pilate unless he was being buried as a criminal instead of being surrendered to his family, which was normally done, but not in all cases. It was it's just a charitable thing to do. It's the right thing to do. You kill the person's family, you give them the body back. But that doesn't mean that he did it in Jesus's case, or nor does it mean that Jesus couldn't have been buried by Joseph of Arimathea or by anybody else in the dirt. Because he surrendered the body to Thea doesn't mean he was the tomb.
Looked like you skipped in and out a little bit, but here's the next question. The question for Jim: How much weight does he put in the location of the tomb? If we don't have a location or anything else, does that mean something didn't happen?
No, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. But the fact of the matter is that with the amount of importance that a site like that would have for early Christians it's immeasurable by far. I mean, even Paul talks about it. The best evidence that Jesus rose from the dead is a tomb. That is the best evidence, is the tomb. If there's not a tomb, then how do you prove that?
So with the tomb being a convincing point for you, is that the absolute convincing point for you that Jesus resurrected from, if you find the tomb? Will that be the it for you?
No, it doesn't follow. Just because Jesus was buried in a tomb does not mean that he was that he resurrected. And conversely, just because Jesus resurrected doesn't mean he was buried in a tomb.
So let me ask you this question, because I've been wanting to ask this question.
Yeah, bro.
How do you accept his history? Because it seems that you come from a very extremely skeptical position. I mean, almost a radical skeptic. And it seems that you're there.
Yeah, as an early atheist, I was a mythicist.
Yeah. So how would you deal with someone like Martin Luther King? You never met the guy? I mean, we're not talking about way back in the 1700s, 1800s, you know.
Sure.
So someone relatively early in history, late in history, if you will. Martin Luther King, was he an actual historical figure?
Yes, absolutely.
Why was he a historical figure? What evidence do you say that he's a historical figure?
Well, the type and the scope of evidence of possibilities for evidence that we have now far outmeasure what they had then. We have videos of Dr. King. We have his speeches. We have his signature. I mean, we have his family members still. We have court records from the times he was arrested. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest, and I also want to remind you that far removed. But we're about as far removed from Dr. King as the authors of the Gospels were from the death of Jesus.
So because we have
a little farther
videos, so the Gospels, so you don't accept the Gospels or any of the biblical text manuscripts as literal historical documentation. You would not accept them as historical documentation.
No, they don't purport to be historical documents. So let's just say that cameras didn't exist. Let's say that we have the exact type of evidence, maybe not the same amount, but we have the same type of evidence for Dr. King as we do for Jesus. Okay. Would I believe that Dr. King existed? Yes, more so than I would believe that Jesus existed, because of what I know of Dr. King. And it would depend on the oral transmission. So if it's different from what my current understanding of who he is, that could change. But what I know about Dr. King, he's not mythologized. All the accounts the individual accounts that I've read about him they coincide. Like there's no big oh, that's questionable, whatever. We have writings from him, from his wife, from his kids, other family members. His speeches still influence many people today. So that would be like, somebody in the late first century or early second century Palestine, hearing about Jesus saying, hey, you should be good to one another. You do unto others, you would have them do unto yourself. Then they're like, man, yeah, like it's about time that somebody stood up to these assholes and and attempted to try to start something, try to really build a movement and change the status quo, that we don't have to be this dogmatic, which is crazy to think that Jesus was anything but dogmatic, is what most people think, but to me, he was a rebel. He was an antithetical rebel.
So so let's take it further back. Someone like Abraham Lincoln or something like that, somebody who doesn't have a bunch of video footage or anything like that.
I'll remind people, there's a great page on Facebook called "Did Abraham Lincoln Exist?"
Right.
I mean, clearly he didn't exist.
Right. So a lot of it would be the same.
So
a lot of it would be the same process that I do for Jesus. So if I heard that Abraham Lincoln wore a stovepipe hat, I'd be like, okay, yeah, a lot of people wore stovepipe hats then. And then somebody said Andy hunted vampires, I would go, what? Like I need some evidence for that.
Mike, what you think, man? What's your thoughts on that, man? I mean, we got Abraham Lincoln. We only have documentation this guy existed. We don't have any video footage. We have eyewitnesses. Yeah, we have eyewitnesses. We have historical documentation that say he existed. Will we not be able to use the same measure of evidence and same measure of critique when we're dealing with an individual like Jesus Christ and the buried in the tomb, resurrection? Don't we have that?
I mean, I like comparing Jesus with Hannibal. I think there's some fun correlations I can make there. But with Abraham Lincoln, I thought the example Jim gave was great, because the vampire hunter novels came, over 100 years after he existed. The Gospels are written much closer. Even Bart Ehrman acknowledges those have historical data in them, and the later Gnostic Gospels do not. So yeah, let's go on that measure. I love that kind of idea for that kind of standard for judging.
What if someone were to say that well, yeah, but in these novels though, like we see these, like this passage right here, this chapter, like this has been examined by historians and by paleographers, and they've determined that this is an early creed. Like this was most likely said within 5 years of Abraham Lincoln's assassination.
Yeah, the Gnostics did the same thing. They took things out of the Gospels and they reused them in their accounts.
Right, but does that increase the reliability of the rest of the vampire novel?
No, because they're late and they're clearly not reliable. They're clearly written as fiction. I mean, we know this basically from studying the historical aspects.
Well, yeah, they're late. I mean, they're late, but they have aspects, and they have contents and inspiration from old texts, like around Abraham Lincoln's time. You know, they talk about him, like they know his mom's name, like they know everything about him.
Well, let's just cut to the chase. No, I don't believe every miracle or a non-naturalist account just because it's reported somewhere. We judge each miracle case based on the evidence for it. I recommend people read the book The Jesus Legend for that with regarding this kind of argument. The first couple chapters cover it.
Miracle or not, that's how we should treat every claim that we're unsure of. I mean, it doesn't have to be a miracle for us to give the same treatment.
Right.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Nothing there to disagree with.
All right, next question, fellas.
Yeah. So I mean, it all depends on the claim. So it's like whenever you say, like, you know, Dr. King and Jesus, you know, would you believe me with the same evidence or whatever? It's like, well, the claims about Dr. King and who he was are there's nothing outstanding. There's nothing questionable. There's nothing that I feel like needs to be investigated. You know, like okay, well, maybe he had 5 eggs for breakfast instead of 2, like you say. You know, but maybe so. Maybe it's not historical that he had 2 eggs for breakfast. But yeah, you have to take each claim and hold it individually to the standard.
Agreed.
All right, next question. This for you, Mike. If Joseph of Arimathea was shown to be mere Deus ex machina, I believe I pronounced that right, machina. How
Deus
would
ex
you view
machina.
the tomb in which Jesus was reportedly placed?
So, I'm not all up to date with the young lingo the kids are using. What does this mean? Deus ex mean made up?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's one of the oldest languages, but.
I mean, if he was made up, I mean, sure, then I would of course have to doubt the whole account. But I mean, it'd be very hard to prove that he was made up. I mean, given what we know with regards to history, I mean, I don't see any reason to think he was made up with regards to that. I mean, I'm gonna do a video soon replying to John Loftus on Joseph of Arimathea and all the ridiculous arguments he uses.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think they would make Jesus up as a whole, because there's no way that they would put themselves through that much trouble with Jesus being crucified and all that. If they make up a Messiah, he'd be a Billy Badass. He wouldn't have died by Roman hand.
I mean, but Jim, have you considered Carrier's argument about the cosmic sperm bank?
I considered it for about 3 seconds.
I love
and that was
that
long
argument.
enough for me to go, wait, what?
All right. Yeah, next question. Let's see. This for you, Jim. Would you say that it's because you are empiricist that you do not believe Jesus was buried in a grave? Do you believe people to know anything without it being validated through empiricism?
Well, I mean, I guess, is an eyewitness account empiricism? I mean, what do you consider empiricism? I mean, are we talking like eyewitness, like you yourself with your senses perceived this, or you are aware that somebody somewhere perceived this and they're claiming that they perceived this? I mean, you can draw that line wherever you want, but I mean, I don't know. It's just not convincing, and I don't think that Again, I don't want to say all Christians, but I will say that I don't believe that most Christians would accept extraordinary claims of a supernatural nature that are traditions of other religions or cultures that they may not agree with, and come to the conclusion that they are historical based on things like, oh, well, the consistency of the accounts or whatever. I don't know. I think there's
I
a
would
lot
probably,
of bias there.
I would probably say that Christians may accept miracle claims from other worldviews based on and consider it demonic, because they're like I would say like something like Mormonism, you know, the angel Gabriel coming down speaking to Joseph Smith. I would consider that demonic.
I
But
always say I always say I love when atheists bring up other miracle claims and debates because they're just shooting themselves in the foot. At best, we can just say there are multiple evidence for multiple miracles. Like when they try to argue for miracles to counter the resurrection argument, I have come to the conclusion just to agree with them, and then just agree that there are other miracles, and then where are we at? Okay, you agree in the divine now? I mean, I never understood why they would take that argument.
But why would they have Joseph? Why would Joseph be talking to rocks inside of his hat in order to translate what's on these golden plates? Like, well, why? Like, if it's not historical, then why not coming up with something a little less embarrassing, right?
Well, what I like about Mormonism, my favorite thing, is that they try to explain the fact that the Book of Mormon says there's horses in the New World. So Mormon apologists will say, well, no, they're referring to tapirs. They're referring to tapirs in the New World. Yeah. Here's the problem. You have to picture ancient Jews in Mexico riding tapirs in the battle. Just remember that. That's Mormonism right there.
Well, picture Jesus making an appearance here, and he's wearing a trucker cap and holding a beer koozie.
Well, I mean, obviously Jesus is from the South. Haven't you been to a Southern church?
Obviously, get her done, Jesus.
all right, fellas. All right, next question. This is for, let me find one for IP. All right, here you go. Let me see. All right, this for you, Mike. Why think that these are eyewitness accounts, though? Why think that these are eyewitness accounts, though? Matthew copies Mark word for word on his own conversion story. That's a weird thing to do if it was written by Matthew.
Okay, so let's cover that. Okay, so let's just say that, yeah, he was copying Mark. I don't see that as a problem. Mark, the evidence suggested Mark was the interpreter of Peter, so he was getting his information from Peter, who was the prince of the apostles. If, let's say, my mother wrote an account about my father that happened like 10 years ago, like maybe, he did some weird miracle or something, and I decided I was going to write an extended account today based on what I saw, I could use that considering it's my mother, and my mother was much closer to my father than me, obviously. So I could use that for the same reason Matthew can use the words of Peter. I don't see that much as a problem. Second of all, I don't have much time to get into this, but check out a book called The Jesus Legend, which covers a lot of regarding the oral traditions regarding the New Testament itself and the Gospels. They cover a lot of good evidence that what we're seeing here is reliable oral traditions within there. Eventually, I'm going to, who knows when, I'll do videos on eyewitness testimony, and I want to do another video on oral tradition accounts and why the Gospels are reliable oral traditions. But I need to read at least a dozen more books before I do that. So there's a lot I need to get into.
Jim, your thoughts?
The only problem that with Matthew using Mark is how much of it he uses. I think there's it's over 90% of Mark is what Matthew uses. A lot of it verbatim, and the problem there is that while Mark is Peter's interpreter, Mark would, if Mark did indeed write it, which I don't believe he did, he would be writing it after the death of Peter in the 60s. So he would be just a translator of Peter's, whereas Matthew was an eyewitness. He saw these events with his own eyes. So why would an eyewitness depend upon the interpreter of somebody who told him something who is now dead? Probably about 50 years after his death. No, I'm sorry,
So,
not 50. No, I'm sorry, not 50 years after his death.
just to get some sources on this, check out Bruce Rosen.
10 years.
Check out check out Bruce Rosenblum and Complexity of Oral Tradition and Dave Rubin and Memory and Oral Tradition. They note there have been studies done on oral traditions within actual oral cultures versus modern cultures. And a lot of times we are imposing our modern Western standards on oral cultures. They were actually far better at preserving oral traditions than we are. And there's actually been experiments done. There was an experiment done with Cambridge students about preserving oral traditions, and they made far more errors that you would see in like an oral culture. So check out those sources I listed. They give some pretty interesting examples that there's reliability within these oral cultures that we are rejecting based on our modern Western standards.
Can I tell you something, Mike?
Sure.
This is my favorite part of your debates, and I was really looking forward to this. Is your book recommendations? Like, legitimately love it.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
All right. Stop all there, though. They handed over compliments. Good stuff, man.
Jim, one day I want to recommend your books. So you better write one soon.
Well, I had a publishing deal supposed to be published last year, but it fell through. It's sitting on my desk.
Have you tried?
I'll eventually publish it. I just don't want to publish. But I'm going to wait until I graduate before I publish anything or put any effort into publishing anything.
I agree. I'm going to do the same.
All right, Jim,
I want that I want that big D on the spine. You know what I mean?
A few more questions and we'll close this thing out. Question for Jim: would you ever die for something you knew was a lie? If not, why? Why do you think the Jesus disciples chose to?
Would I die for something that is a lie?
Yeah, that
like I'm guessing like
lie.
like you're saying like somebody telling me something and like, you know, do this or die or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, if would you?
No,
yeah.
no, I can't imagine a scenario that I would. But then again, there's not much that you can do that you get me to die for. But
Mike, any thoughts?
No, I wouldn't die for anything I knew was a lie.
If not, why? Why would the disciples do it then?
Let's be careful with where we go on this in terms of evidence. I'm very careful in terms of how I word those types of things. I do think there was evidence for early persecution. Do I think do we have evidence? We can argue definitively every disciple died for their belief in Jesus' resurrection? No. But we do have some evidence, like in Clement of Rome, Paul mentions some persecutions. I think Acts is reliable with regards to that. But I mean, topic for another time with regards to that.
But what do you think about the necessity to be given an opportunity to recant?
What do you mean?
Like, do you think that in order to be considered a martyr, they would have to be given a separate option, like a way out, like a deal, basically?
What we can gather from early Christians is that they were told to sacrifice to the emperor as if he was God, and they chose not to, saying Jesus was king. So I would say they would probably given that type of thing, like, you know.
So if somebody, like, say a house church got raided during service, and they were living in one of these provinces where it was very, very heavily policed, and deadly force was enforced, and so they take them and torture them, do whatever. But they're not given a chance to recant. They're just being punished for breaking the law. But they're doing this in secret. It's like me. If I was living in a state that was illegal and I happen to be smoking something that is illegal, and I get arrested for it, and I can't do anything. It's against my will. They don't say, hey, if you say you weren't smoking weed, I'll let you go right now. No, there's none of that. Like, they're taking me to jail. I wouldn't consider myself a weed martyr.
Okay, I don't really.
So I think that unless they had another option besides being punished for their beliefs, that's something more than oppression. That's not martyrdom.
The option, as we see in the early church, was they were given a chance to sacrifice to the emperor as if he was God, and they chose not to. That would be what I would respond with.
Oh no, a lot of them did, and a lot of them paid for false papers. A lot of them, and a lot of them even actually gave libations. They actually made a grain offering at the Temple of Jupiter. We have accounts of it happening, and then they go back to the church and say, "I'm sorry."
Yeah, I know that we're talking about later witnesses that did that. We're also referring to, again, to when I talk about the early sources like Paul's persecution or Peter's persecution or that kind of stuff. So I mean,
they weren't given a chance to recant because and Paul wasn't executed for his for being a Christian.
How do you know that?
It doesn't say he was.
Well, I'm referring to the letter of First Clement of Rome. He mentions that Peter and Paul were executed in Rome for their faith, basically.
Sure, that's one account that at a time when self-sacrifice was popular, it would make them look good, much like not talking bad about somebody at their funeral.
Yeah, self-sacrifice was sure. I mean, I would love to kill myself too if it was popular.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it happened a lot, but there is some evidence to suggest that some people willingly got in line, whenever it was like, lunchtime at the Coliseum, and they were like, yeah, it's a free ticket to heaven. Like, I don't have to worry about being good for the rest of my life. Like, let me just go to heaven now.
All right, this is our final question here, and this is for you, Mike. Says, Mike, do you think there's more evidence for Jesus than there is for other biblical characters?
Absolutely. I think there was tons of evidence for Jesus. And I want to do a video specifically on Tacitus and go over Carrier's article with regards to that. I just haven't had time to get around to it. There's tons of evidence for Jesus. You have it in Tacitus, Josephus, Marabar. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but there's Lucian. Celsus even admits it. Paul, for example, mentions an historical Jesus, despite what mysticists like to say. I'd say Jesus might.
But is there more evidence?
Yeah, there's more evidence than Jesus. That's a good question. I have argued extensively for the ossuary for his brother James. I think there is a lot of evidence to attest for that. So I would say that we do have a sufficient evidence. And again, I would actually argue that, we do have sufficient evidence in external sources like Tacitus, Josephus. And in terms of people like Pilate or Herod, you could argue possibly there are more with regards to that. I was thinking more about like central Christian figures, but I get your point with regards to Herod. There might be more because we have coins and whatnot for that, But I mean, we have coins of Zeus.
Like Philo maybe, or Gamaliel.
I mean, Gamaliel's in the Bible, yeah, but I mean, Gamaliel, we don't actually have any contemporary sources.
Keep on your toes, Mike.
So, I think we have plenty of enough evidence for Jesus, and of course, Jim agrees with me on this. But I do appreciate the fact that I didn't think he would do this, and I appreciate he didn't bring up the argument that Carrier uses, which is that Arimathea means best disciple town, which is such a dumb argument.
I mean, it can be read like that, but that's not a prescriptive. Or a descriptive breakdown of the etymology. It's kind of seems like there's a lot of there's an agenda behind it, right?
Even if he's right that Arimathea means best disciple town, he's shooting himself in the foot because the Jews love puns. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar is not his real name. Sure. His real name is Nebuchadrezzar, meaning Nebu protects the eldest son. What do the Jews change it to? Nebuchadnezzar, meaning Nebu protects the jackass. They love puns. They change meanings of names all the time to mean puns. So if Arimathea is a pun to mean Beth Disciple Town based on another town name, it would be consistent with Jewish standard practices. So they're shooting themselves in the foot.
Yep. Yeah. And they were also fond of using numbers to represent people and things. I've even heard pretty good arguments for the day of Pentecost being confused for the 500.
Oh, they loved numbers, yeah.
Just because the words are so similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
I didn't mean to go down a rabbit hole, but I really enjoyed this.
There's one more question. One more question.
And again, I apologize for not having my stuff, man.
It's not your fault, Jim. It's not your fault, man. This is the last question right here.
It probably is. I probably downloaded something I shouldn't have.
All right, IP, this you again, man. Given what we know about Pilate's brutality, why is he portrayed as reluctant in the Gospels? Does Barabbas' exchange have merit historically?
Okay, so I'm going to leave the Barabbas thing alone because I have a video coming out literally this 1 week from today on Barabbas. I'm going to give merit to it. Regarding Pilate, I'm going to cover that. So regarding Pilate, people think Pilate is this horrible, evil person because of apparently what Josephus and Philo tell us. But if you actually read what they tell us, he doesn't really sound that bad of a guy. Josephus says that he put Roman shields on the temple, and the Jews protested. What happens? Well, he says, I'm going to kill you. The Jews say, do it. And he says, all right, I'm not going to kill you. And he took down the shields. Okay, so he caved the demands of the Jews. He didn't want to kill anyone.
Mark or John.
Second incident, he says that he was building temple. He took temple funds to build an aqueduct. And the Jews protested that. He put people in the crowds to sort of disperse the crowds. It says that some of the guards or some of the soldiers went too far and killed some people, but Pilate didn't want that. So again, he didn't want to kill anyone. And then the third incident is he apparently attacked the Samaritans who were planning to rebuild their temple and not Gerizim. So they went, and Josephus tells us they went out with arms, and he put to death all the leaders of the thing. So ironically, I think Pilate actually aligns quite well with what we see in the Gospels. If you look at what he says and what Philo says on him, Philo says that Pilate put shields on Herod's palace. The Jews protested, and they said, we're going to write to Tiberius if you don't take them down. And then Philo says that Pilate was extremely distressed by this. What do we see in the Gospels? If you don't crucify him, you are no friend of Caesar. Pilate goes, all right, crucify him. Interesting around this same time period is Tiberius had just uncovered a plot by someone named Sejanus. Sejanus was trying to seize the throne. He had killed Tiberius' son. And after Tiberius found this out, he became extremely paranoid, killed anyone associated with Sejanus. It seems the Jews were using that against Pilate. He was extremely paranoid, as Philo records, about falling out of favor with Tiberius. I think it might have to do something with the fact that Sejanus, the plot of Sejanus, had just bothered Tiberius, and everyone was on walking on eggshells with Tiberius. So anytime the Jews bring up, we're going to write to Tiberius, or you're no friend of Caesar, Pilate caves, does whatever they want to do. He takes the shields off Herod's palace, as Philo records us. So I'll have a video probably at the end of August on this. I need to finish editing the video, but I think what we see in the Gospels is quite consistent with what we see in Josephus and Philo. And I'll talk about some of the language Philo uses because some scholars like Brian McGinn have written extensively with regards to the language that Philo uses on this.
Well, and I think it's to remember that it's important to remember that Pilate was a ruler. He didn't just kill people. He kept the peace, and the Jewish population was a significant one and a very at that point a very integral part of the entire area. Of everywhere. It had a huge population, so it was in his best interest to not upset them. And if something happened that the Jews got upset enough about to speak out against more than one of them, then it makes sense that he would just give in, especially if he didn't have anything to lose. Like with Jesus, in Mark, Pilate is very passive, and he's it's almost like he doesn't really care. He's like, whatever. But the Jews want to kill him. Like they're like, no, you need to do this. What's that?
I completely agree, Jim. Jesus and Pilate had nothing to lose in allowing Joseph of Arimathea to bury Jesus in a tomb.
But what about? No, he didn't have anything to lose. But he didn't know that he was going to bury him in a tomb. He just released the body to him, which releasing bodies was common. The only thing that's strange is that he wasn't a family member. That's the only thing I find strange about that.
Agreed.
All right, fellas. That's it, man. Thank you two for joining me. And it was a great debate, great discussion. And I do want to go. I would love for us to be able to do this again and allow you to get your notes and everything, Jim. It's not your fault.
Yeah.
The computer failed. Stuff happens.
Yeah,
you know
like,
what I mean? But I think you still did good. I think you still did great considering the circumstances. And I would love to give you another opportunity, man. And so we can.
Well, it only had my opening statement. Like the opening statement is just like my outline. Like if I had that, I'd be good. But like, yeah.
It's all good, man. It's all good. Mike, as always, man, it's your third time being on the show. Hey, if y'all ain't seen Mike, that's third.
No, you're right. Third.
I brought you an interview and then 2 debates. And if you
Right.
check out Mike's debate with about Christmas being a pagan holiday, y'all might want to check that one out, man. That was a good one. That was fun.
It's so much fun on that.
That was fun. That was an enjoyable one, man. So when you guys get a chance, check that out, man. But I do thank you guys for coming on. And as always, Mike, did I send you a gift? I sent you a gift, right? After the Christmas debate. I believe I sent you a gift.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah,
Is this
there
it?
it is.
I can't tell.
Yeah, that's it right there. That's it right there. So, Jim, I'm going to be reaching out to you, man. I'm going to send you a gift. I send out gifts for those who come on here and volunteer their time. So I'll be sending you a gift, Jim. And thank you guys again. And I'm going to close this thing out, man.
Appreciate it.
All right. See y'all in a minute. All right, folks, another good one in the books, man. This is some heavy stuff right here, man. You better get up on your history, man, thinking about this subject, man. So it was a great one. I hope everyone out there learned something. You know, with the gospel truth, we're engaging the culture of Christian truth, and we do that through debates, interviews, and Bible lessons. And this is this type of debate was very heavy historical concepts. So I hope and pray that you guys learned something, whether you're an atheist viewing or whether you're a Christian viewing. I'm sure there was something that you could learn and take away from this debate that perhaps could correct the misunderstanding. And, you know, when we think about the idea of Jesus, the historical Jesus, was he buried into, was he resurrected? You know, when we think about these ideas, we have to be honest with ourselves. You know, we can't allow our bias to the best we can. We have biases and we have presuppositions, but we have to allow our biases to be as minimized as possible when dealing with this, so we can look at things in a more accurate manner. And that's what I hope for everyone out there, is that you guys are able to look at everything and minimizing your bias as much as you can to look at everything fairly. Do your research, dissect this stuff, critique the stuff properly with fairness. And I think if you do that, you'll come to a correct conclusion of whatever you're trying to look for. With that said, I do want to go ahead and go over a couple of announcements before I get out of here. Let me bring this up. All right, coming up July 27th, does the Bible teach that remarriage is always sinful? That's coming up at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, against Jack Shannon and Stephen Boyce. So that should be a great debate. After that, Joseph Law versus Jeremiah Nortier. That's another 3 p.m. debate. Different worldview perspectives, Mormon versus Christian. So hopefully you can join me on that one. After that, I have Ritzel Suttles versus Robert McKever. Atheist versus Christian. Are our moral intuitions necessarily moral facts? That's coming up August 3rd at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that, I have myself versus Riz. We're going to be talking about a little bit morality. That's coming up August 11th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'm looking forward to this, and it should be fun. You know, I'm jumping into the octagon this time, so it should be a fun discussion. Hope you could join me on all these shows. Once again, that is just the next 4 shows coming up on the Gospel Truth. Make sure you're liking, make sure you're subscribing, make sure you're hitting that notification bell so you can stay in the loop with all the shows that are coming up in the future. And be on the lookout for everything, man, because some great things are happening at the Gospel Truth. With that said, I'm going to get out of here. May God bless you and may God keep you. I'm gone.